I'm going to say something that's going to make some people feel very uncomfortable. Shaytan may be the best Muslim. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Violet Gateway. I'm John Vermillion. I'm not saying Shaytan is righteous. I'm not telling anybody to follow Shaytan, nor am I telling you not to. I'm not saying evil is good. I'm purely saying that it exists. And I want to look at this from a much different perspective. So, what does it really mean to submit to God? We throw the words out like Muslim, Christian, Satanist, Hindu, Luciferian, all these labels. And yet we understand there's things associated with these things, no matter what of those you are or consider yourself. There's always prayer, there's always a form of fasting, there's the holy books like the Quran, the Injil, the Torah, plenty of grimoires. There's always some kind of rules or guidelines that we have to follow. And no matter what we practice and align to, it ends up kind of becoming our spiritual identity. Sometimes the spiritual identity becomes so strict and dense that telling everybody else what you're doing wrong or what they're doing wrong is the common denominator. So when we look at submission, submission isn't just what we say with our mouth. It's what happens when God's will conflicts with our own will. And it goes back to what I've said before, divine will might not be your own will. Nobody demonstrates this contradiction better than Iblis, Shaytan. He knew God. He knew God very well. He acknowledged God. He worshiped God very devotedly. And yet he fell. Why? It's his ego. And to understand why, we actually have to go back to the story of Azazil. In the Quran, Iblis is identified as being from the jinn, but in later Islamic and esoteric traditions, we encounter another name associated with him, Azazil. In these traditions, Azazil was a tremendously devoted being, a servant who had spent ages in worship, moving among the celestial realms, having access to both the jinn worlds and the angelic kingdoms. And then humanity was created, not from light like the angels, not from smokeless fire like the jinn, but from clay. And when the command came to bow before Adam, Azazil refused. His reasoning was simple. I am better than him. I am made from fire, and he is made from clay. For your new creation will be forgetting who their Lord is. And that is where everything changes, because his failure wasn't that he didn't know God. He knew God. He knew God very well, intimately and personally. His failure was that when God's command conflicted with his own understanding, his ego won, and Azazil becomes Iblis. The devoted servant then becomes the adversary, Shaytan. The adversary doesn't overthrow God. In fact, he can't. He doesn't become God's equal, nor try to be. He remains a creature created by the Creator. His function only to whisper, tempt, mislead, and create resistance. And the whisper reveals whether you actually submit, or whether your ego says, I know better. And that is where the story of Shaytan stops being about some ancient being, and really starts becoming a story reflected in each one of us. Iblis didn't fall because he suddenly stopped believing in God. He didn't become an atheist. He didn't discover another God and start worshiping that God. He didn't become God's equal either. Nor did he go to war with him. He simply refused to submit to that new creation, Adam, the Adamic race. And that's an important distinction, because you can believe in God, you can still refuse God, and you can still know God, and still put yourself above God's command. You can practice religion and still be ruled by your ego. The real test of submission isn't when God agrees with you. The real test is kind of when you disagree with God. And then things like prayer, we realize it doesn't automatically kill the ego. Knowledge doesn't help the ego. Often it inflates it. The religious clothing that you may wear and adorn yourself with is really just a reflection of the ego. Being able to quote scripture really means nothing. And correcting everybody sure definitely does not kill your ego. So the question really comes down to, what happens when your will and God's will doesn't really line up? Shaytan doesn't force you to do anything. He whispers, he suggests. Often there's temptation. The energy in those whispers often makes something attractive. There's always presented an alternative. But he doesn't choose for you. This is the power of free will. The choice is still yours. And this is where resistance really comes in. Resistance reveals your strength. These temptations that you battle definitely reveals your character. And all the difficulties that we go through and all the changes and movements that we have in life typically reveals your faith. And that choice actually reveals what is inside of you. And there's always a battle between that ego and the self of knowing. So if there's really nothing to resist, how do we know what we're capable of resisting? When we talk about submitting, we must ask ourselves, who is actually submitting? Is it the person that looks religious, who knows all the rules, is judging everybody on their righteousness and what they're doing right or wrong? Is it a person that thinks they're spiritual superior? Like a lot of cult leaders and a lot of religious leaders. A lot of time religion feeds the ego. Or is it the person that is the most in the righteousness of God, the one with struggles? They make mistakes. They have desires. They have weaknesses, which they own up to. But yet everything they do is still surrendered to God. If Shaytan knew God, his problem wasn't ignorance at all. His problem was ego, and that's why his story is so relevant, and it fits in every single one of our energetic structures. So the lesson isn't don't believe in Satan. The lesson is don't become Iblīs. Don't think about the I am better. I am more righteous. I am more knowledgeable. I'm a better Muslim. I'm a better Christian. I'm a better Satanist. There's a lot of that. Who's the most satanic Satanist? You can't be sitting there saying all these people are going to hell and they're going to go do this. You don't know the heart. You can't say somebody's not a real believer even if they're following Shaytan. And you definitely can't go around thinking that you have all the answers and think that God agrees with you, because we all know that divine will is highly outside of your personal will. Doing the things that are flashy, that's not submission. That is just the ego putting on religious or spiritual clothing. And we might look at Shaytan as, a contradictory concept, especially when it comes to Islam and Muslims, and me saying a very provocative statement saying that Shaytan is the best Muslim. But Shaytan knows that he remains God's creation. He never becomes God equal. He never escapes his divine sovereignty. He knows he can't defeat God. And he doesn't operate outside of creation. He always has one foot here and one foot there, stretched out upon the circle. And it's kind of ironic. The being who refused to bow to a creation, Adam, still cannot escape the one that created Adam. So he whispers, he tempts, he tries to mislead and to test you. He tests your personal power. But also, Shaytan can give you personal power. Working with him in the left-hand path, you get immense personal power. But it's also fueled by the ego. And once we get over that ego, even that personal power becomes even more divine. Shaytan knows God remains. So when I call Shaytan the best Muslim, I'm talking about something very specific. He remains completely and utterly subject to the reality of God and the oneness of it, even while performing his function as the adversary. Because that's what he's doing. He's performing a function of the adversary. And when you don't listen, and you decide to listen to the whispers, he turns and says, "Do you see, my Lord? They do not hear you. They're choosing otherwise." realistically reasserting his original point. So we have to make this kind of personal about ourselves. Really reflect about yourselves. How are you when nobody is watching? How do you treat someone who can't benefit you? How do you treat someone who hurt you or did you wrong? What happens when you're angry or sad? What's your reaction? What's your triggers? Do you often take advantage of people? Do you manipulate people? What happens when your desires conflict with what you know is right? That whole right and wrong. This is really what I mean by this is your Islam. This is your submission. It's not your appearance. It's not the clothes you wear. It's not the arguments that you have, whether righteous or not. It's not about your social media posts and how many people you corrected on it. It's really about what do you do when your ego doesn't get what it wants. That's really where your submission is tested. And that's where Iblis failed. So the battle is never God versus Shaytan. In fact, God has no equal. Shaytan is also not God's opposite. The true battle between those wars is really your ego. You, your soul, versus the ego of the personality. So you might not get to choose every thought that you have. You definitely don't get to control every temptation. You definitely don't get to control everybody's behavior or have a say in what they decide. But you are responsible for your response. And that's where we can go from what's the ego versus to moving outside of the ego. Not getting rid of the ego completely, but it's still moving outside of it. So the adversary may provide the test, and that's what Shaytan is. He's a great teacher, and he teaches by, yes, finding personal power within you and testing you. Overcoming those whispers and overcoming those desires moves you and advances you energetically and with personal power that you would be giving away if you did them. Remember, Shaytan knows God. He worships God. He acknowledges God's existence. He basically works for him because his function is to do what he does. Therefore, we know that knowing God is not enough. Talking about God isn't enough. Performing every little deed of the religions or spiritual practices is really not enough. You actually have to surrender. And that's not surrendering to even God. It's surrendering to your ego. Surrendering and getting past that egoistic aspects. So maybe Shaitan's greatest weapon isn't making you stop believing in God. It's convincing you to think you know better and perhaps not even believe in yourself as a full potential being. So really ask yourself this. Are you actually submitting to God? Or are you simply submitting to the version of God that would agree with you? Because there is a big difference here. And perhaps that's the real lesson of Shaytan. He doesn't want to stop you from believing. Not at all. In fact, you'd almost have to if you believe in him. He only has to make you believe you know better and to think you're right. And if you can do that, he's already won the argument.